I always say that, at least in the financial world, you should always plan for failure in the following respects. Don't spend all your time convincing that the bad thing won't happen. Just assume the bad thing is going to happen. The U.S. housing market's going to fall apart. We're going to have a trade war, okay? Don't debate about whether or not we're going to have a trade war. Assume we're going to have a very bad trade war. Assuming that that's there, what should we be doing now to prepare for that so that the trade war doesn't amplify through our financial system and through our economy? And then if we don't have a trade war, then we're in great shape. And by the way, the fact that you have done that means that you're in a better position to negotiate on a trade war, right? So, because you don't have to worry. Okay, so that's one of the elements. But then the other element, and I'll hand back, which is fundamental, and this is a challenge, but it's the reason we have political processes. It's one of the many reasons, but is to forge a consensus of where you want to go as a society. What matters? You know, how much do we care about in the AI, the coming AI revolution, which tends to get talked about in terms of, HAL compute. If anyone remembers HAL from, you remember HAL.
HAL from 2001. Okay.
Yeah, from 2001. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. You don't even remember. You can Google it afterwards. What's politely known in AI circles as P-doom, probability of doom. So those more esoteric issues, well, they're fundamental, but they're esoteric, as opposed to what it's going to mean to people's jobs, to work, and our society. You can see where that's going, and you can prepare for it. We can prepare for it now, so that AI is for all as opposed to only some, and on. And that's the type of way, I think. It's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's the type of thing you can do to start to build trust in and around it.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned in answer before that about taking responsibility. I just want to shift a bit from the central banking world to where you are now with Brookfield in the world of finance. And what is the role of responsibility taking in terms of trust in the financial sector? Because a very common critique, which has a lot of value to it, I think, is that when bad things are done by the titans of finance, if they get caught, they don't get punished. That sort of idea of a kind of immunity. So 2 examples, just the most recent one in the Toronto Dominion Bank with its case in the United States, big fine for money laundering, or not enforcing their money laundering, but the executives there remain in place, though they're not criminally sanctioned. Or another example was, say, the role of McKinsey during the opioid crisis, and they can acknowledge that they were helping Purdue Pharma get people addicted to opioids. The general managing partner, Dominic Martin of McKinsey at the time, he said he didn't know what was happening, but he was an advisor to our prime minister in the transition. He was our ambassador. So it doesn't look like there are responsibilities being taken. You're in that world now of finance. You're now official titan of finance, I gather. Where's the trust there, or is the premise of my question wrong? I don't think it is. That's my premise, obviously. But where is that? Where does the responsibility come there in building trust in? So this is not the world of banking and government finance, but private finance.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did when I was at the Bank of England went to exactly this issue, which we put in place something called the senior managers regime. So certainly the CEO and the chair and CFO, but quite reasonably thick layer of senior managers of financial institutions, regulated financial institutions in the UK. And we changed the compensation structure, and we changed the ability to claw back compensation in circumstances where they had taken either excessive risks, they hadn't overseen their employees who were doing bad things properly. So the I didn't know about it defense didn't hold because you had to put in place processes to make sure you did know about it. And if you hadn't done that, then you'd be responsible. And what is in place there is an ability, so compensation is deferred. That happens quite often. And if you find out mistakes were on your watch of these type, you don't get that deferred compensation. But we also extended it in the case of criminal activity that could happen in the institution, that you could go back and claw back compensation that had been paid out up to 10 years, okay? Up to 10 years. So very tight and with discretion. And there are a number of examples where that has been the case in the UK. So that's something that I believe in terms of structure. And I think that's hugely important. Now you ask about Brookfield. I mean, the way Brookfield people are compensated is.
You may have heard of think tanks before, but have you heard of Cardus? We're here to think, to explore, to propose solutions about work, education, health, family, faith communities, and what makes a society actually thrive. Faith shapes our questions. Evidence drives our answers. If a flourishing society is a priority for you, you really ought to learn more about Cardus.
The vesting, if you will, of most of their compensation is very long term. So in effect, voluntarily, we have the same thing very long term. I mean, out through 10 years. So we have basically the same thing, independently derived, not inspired by the SMR. But I think there's a fundamental point as well. So there's things you can do structurally, and obviously,
But you have that in Canada, in the United States. What you did at the Bank
no, we
of
don't.
England?
We don't.
Okay.
But we should. 100% we should. I'm not in a position to do that. Well, I can advocate. I'm in a position to amplify through this this influential group to have that. There were consequences, by the way, for senior management at TD, but I'll let that go. I think there's a new CEO, TD now.
Yeah, the existing one is retiring. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Anyways, yeah. These things happen the way the world works. But there's a fundamental point adjacent to this. Adjacent isn't the right word, but I'll use it, which is you can't, in the end, legislate virtue, right? It's not contractual, it's cultural. So you can do things contractual that align incentives. UK has done so. A few other jurisdictions have done something similar. But in the end, it's also a cultural question, and it is a question of our expectations of people in positions of authority. And these examples are in finance, but it can hold in a company or in some other public role in a university, however. And taking the responsibility for your actions, of course, but also for those who work with you, work for you, in large organizations, unfortunately, there will always be a law of large numbers. There will be people who do bad things. And the question then becomes, have you taken steps and have you built a culture and an oversight mechanism that makes it less likely that those things will happen? And if they do happen, that they will come to light quickly and be dealt with. And that's a cultural question, a question of expectations.
So let me follow up on that, on the culture of finance, in that I don't go back so far to 2001. That's a film in the 60s, I think was it the 1960s? 2001.
Oh, 2000 Space Odyssey. It was 69, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so that's
Someone
before my
check
time.
that.
But I do go back to.
Well, do you anything that was produced before you were born, like the Bible, for example?
Fair point. There you go. All right. We go back to St. Augustine as Catholics. We don't need to go all the way back to the Bible. That's a lot. I was heading towards what I thought was a clever point, but now you've undermined me.
You may have heard of think tanks before, but have you heard of Cardus? We're here to think, to explore, to propose solutions about work, education, health, family, faith communities, and what makes a society actually thrive. Faith shapes our questions. Evidence drives our answers. If a flourishing society is a priority for you, you really ought to learn more about Cardus.
But in the 80s, there was a book written about the world of finance, Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, which was set in Wall Street. And it was about the culture of the 1980s and how the term he used, which was taken from a children's toy at the time, was that the tech titans were the masters of the universe. That was the term he used for them. And the life of the protagonist unravels because all of a sudden, by some car accident, he gets out of the world he controls, and now his life unravels. So that idea of the masters of the universe, that was Tom Wolfe's characterization of financial world in the 1980s. So you've been in that world for a long time. You said humility goes a long way. How do you promote a culture of humility amongst people who at least are considered by others the masters of the universe?
Right. Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I recall that one of the things, it is also a great book. It is a great book. I think it's a lousy movie, but a great book. It's not the only one. But one of the themes of Wolfe over certainly that book, but other ones, is that there are statospheres. He calls things statospheres.
Statospheres.
Statospheres. So within a discipline, there are hierarchies. And then exactly to your question, that within that hierarchy, and you see this over and over again, where people view, they're at the apex of finance or university or whatever, and they see themselves as untouchable. They lose their reference. They lose their reference not to people within that stratosphere, to use his term, but also within society. And that hubris leads to, inevitably leads to a fall, almost inevitably leads to a fall. And so that is one of the hardest things, which is to, it's an odd way to put it, but institutionalize humility. But I think I think you do need to. I mean, that's one of the lessons I've taken through experience, through various roles I've had, is that you do need to have an approach which has humility at its core, and that doesn't lead to inaction, right? So humility doesn't mean you can't do anything, but it means you plan for failure, as I said earlier. It means that you recognize that you don't have all the answers, so you have a process that builds off of what others, contributions. It means that you admit mistakes when they're made, and if you make a lot of decisions, you will make mistakes. It is much more empowering. I mean, you can't always make mistakes. If you only make mistakes, you don't last forever. But it is much more empowering to admit when you've got made a call, and most calls at the top of a stratosphere, if I can keep with that, are they're tough calls. That's the reason they go up to the top. And if you're doing, Bob Rubin, stay in finance, used to be the U.S. Treasury Secretary, used to always make this point, which was, these are 60-40 decisions, and we made a decision, and it went against us, but it doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. It means that the 40% probability landed. I mean, he's still alive, but he's very much like that. But you admit that it was wrong. Here's why it was wrong, and here's what we're going to do to move forward. So I think all of those aspects are necessary, and that's part of the way it's a better way to manage things, and it's certainly a better way to manage things in a dangerous world. But it also, it's the way a leader prevents themselves, a leader in whatever field, prevents themselves from becoming detached.